Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Nathan Thoma. I am the president of the New York City Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Association, and I want to welcome you all here tonight, and I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Bob Leahy is director of the American Institute for Cognitive Therapy in New York and clinical professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College, right here where we are today. His research focuses on individual differences in emotion regulation and decision making. He is associate editor of the International Journal of Cognitive Therapy and is past president of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, the International Association for Cognitive Psychotherapy, and the Academy of Cognitive Therapy. He is a recipient of the Aaron T. Beck Award from the Academy of Cognitive Therapy. He is the author or editor of 27 books. That's a lot of books. Including Cognitive Therapy Techniques, Emotion Regulation and Psychotherapy, Beat the Blues Before They Beat You, Emotional Schema Therapy, and The Worry Cure, which, by the way, is a book that I regularly recommend to my patients. For me, that's a particularly excellent book. I've read it twice. Maybe it speaks to me personally a little bit. His most recent book is The Jealousy Cure. And I will add that I was personally honored to have Bob write a chapter on emotional schema therapy for my own book on working with emotion in psychotherapy. I would also like to add that Bob was a founding member of the New York City CBT Association and was not only a seminal figure in our genesis, but has acted as an ongoing mentor to all of us on the executive board. And we have all been grateful for his experience and perspective throughout the 10 plus years of NYC CBT's existence. For this reason, he has deservedly maintained the title of Honorary Lifetime President of our organization. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Bob tonight for this presentation entitled, You Shouldn't Feel That Way, Changing Beliefs and Strategies About Disparaged Emotions.
And I'm so glad to be speaking again for New York City CPT Association. I want to thank Nate for his service as the president. I also want to recognize Bob Schachter. Bob, can you stand up and recognize Bob as the first president of the New York City CPT Association? Thank you for helping getting it going and serving on the board. So what I want to talk about tonight is the kind of messages that we give each other about emotion or we get from other people about emotions. I call them disparaged emotions. Emotions that people often think, I shouldn't feel that way. Like I shouldn't feel jealous, I shouldn't feel envious, I shouldn't feel bored, I shouldn't feel ambivalent, I shouldn't feel regret, I shouldn't feel the desire for revenge. How many of you at some point felt jealous about somebody? How many of you felt envious, like, oh, that person's doing better than I? How many of you ever felt bored? How many of you felt ambivalent about something important? How many of you felt resentment about something? How many of you actually fantasize about revenge? I'm going to leave now on that. So I know that I feel better because I know that I never have those problems. And I just wanted to abnormalize things for you. But it's interesting because these are emotions that I would call lived emotions, lived experience. These are part of a meaningful life. My former mentor, David Burns. How many of you have read Feeling Good by David Burns? I think the best self-help book ever written. So David supervised me for a few years, many years ago, when I was first learning cognitive therapy. And David's book is called Feeling Good, which I think is a great book, great title. But I think another book which might be interesting would be Feeling Everything, which would be what life is about. It's about the capacity for all of those emotions. So I want to outline some ideas that I have. I was an English major for a few years in college, so we had to read a lot of literature from other cultures, and this is from 2500 before the current era. And it's about a famous king in what's now Iraq. He had seen everything, had experienced all emotions, from exultation to despair, have been granted a vision into the great mystery, the secret places, the primeval days before the flood. This is 4,500 years ago. He had seen everything, had all the emotions. You think about great art. Just go to the Metropolitan Museum and walk through and think about the emotions that you observe in great art. Emotions of feeling like you're going insane. Emotions of intimacy. The emotions of feeling like nobody can hear you, or you're all alone with your voice. The emotions of turmoil. Great art and great literature are about all of these intense, difficult emotions. They're not about rationality. I remember years ago, when I was first learning cognitive therapy, somebody said to me, "Do you think anybody's going to write a great play about rationality?" I don't think so. One of my favorite plays in American theater history is Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill. How many of you have read or seen Long Day's Journey? It's based on his true story about what it was like growing up with his father and his mother, who was a morphine addict. But great literature, great music, great art is often about emotion. It's not about rationality. So I've been interested in this for a number of years, and my colleagues and I wrote a book trying to cover various major CBT approaches on emotion regulation. In the second edition of the Cognitive Therapy Techniques book, I also describe a lot of different, over like 110 techniques, but some of them are about emotion regulation or how to think about emotion, as well as other things. The two clinical books that I've written about my model of emotional schema therapy, which I'll describe in more detail, a few years ago with Guilford, the one on the left, emotional schema therapy, and then the one on the right is a briefer version of the main points of the model published by Routledge. About a year and a half ago, I published The Jealousy Cure, which in area of work that I found many patients that I have, deal with jealousy or have partners who are jealous and don't know how to cope with it, except by telling people don't feel jealous, which doesn't work. The book I have coming out in June, Don't Believe Everything You Feel, is an attempt, it's like a workbook on emotional schema therapy for patients, but I think actually clinicians might use it as well. Think about we all kind of know what to do for depression or panic disorder or social anxiety disorder or OCD and pretty good protocols for that. But many patients come in with, I guess what I would call existential and self-reflective emotions, complicated emotions. And I've always felt, why should the psychoanalysts have all the fun? Why should they be the only ones who can deal with that kind of thing? I was talking with a colleague here at Cornell, a very senior psychoanalytic psychiatrist, explaining my model. And he said, "Oh, Bob, you're such a phony, you're really psychodynamic." I said, "Well, coming from you, that's a compliment." I explained my model to Beck. He said, "Oh, I understand, it's cognitive therapy." That's right, it's that. I explained my model to Adrian Wells and said, "Oh, I see, it's metacognitive therapy." Friends of mine who do ACT, "Oh, okay, so you're into ACT. I think you do DBT. Oh, yes, it's DBT. So I'm a pretty agreeable guy. I agree with everybody. It's all those things. But it's also something different. It's really a social cognitive model. It's like a theory of mind model about what do you think about your emotions and other people's emotions, and how do you cope with them? How do you cope with your own emotions? How do you respond to the emotions of people that are important in your life? So you think about, how do we learn about emotion? You've studied the Gottman technique, correct? How many of you have studied the Gottman technique? So the John Gottman, preeminent CBT theorist about emotion. So some of this is actually very consistent with the Gottman model of emotion. Gottman has also written about how to respond to your children's emotion. But how do you learn about emotion? What have you learned about emotion? So think about our patients, or think about yourself. As much as you can apply this to yourself, the better it's going to be, I think. So ask your patient, when you were a child, who would you go to if you were upset? Who would you go to? Would you go to your mother, your father, your grandmother, grandfather, brother, sister? I had a patient who I asked this to, who came from a very invalidating environment, and she said she would go to her cat. And we began talking about emotion regulation issues and stuff, and CBT for that. She said, I think I have a good idea, Dr. Leahy. I think I'll get a cat. So she got a cat. And then about 8 months later, she was much improved. And I said, what were the most important things that you've learned in therapy? And she said, to get a cat. But anyway, but she felt with a cat, when she was growing up, that she could always cry in front of the cat and talk to a cat. She wouldn't get invalidated or treated badly. She would be accepted. The question would be, why would you not go to that other person with your vulnerable emotions? How did your mother and how did your father respond? How did it make you feel about your emotions when they responded the way they did? Did it make you feel that your emotions are a burden to other people? That something to be ashamed of? Like, what's wrong with you that you're upset about that? Stupid or absurd? Oh, you're absurd. Or, that's irrational. Does that really help people when they're distressed? That's irrational? Oh, thank you very much. A waste of time? You're wasting your time. Or it's a waste of time for me to share these emotions. About 8 years ago, I wrote a blog for Huffington Post. And it was like, I think what I would call a puff piece. It was like, what to say to somebody who's upset. And it was like active listening, like, rephrase what they say, empathize, validate, ask them for direction, encourage them to express their feelings. And it was gender neutral. And I actually said it's gender neutral. So, usually on Huffington Post and the blog, you might get 10 responses. I got something like 500 responses, mainly from men, telling me that if you talk to women this way, they'll just go on and on and on, and that they don't know how to solve problems, and you're wasting the time and all this kind of stuff. And this guy Leahy, I don't think he's ever been with a woman. And so I asked my wife, and she said, maybe they have a point. So I'm getting more pissed off reading this. So I think I'll write an article called "Why Men Don't Listen to Women," and I actually took their complaints and I went through each one of them, pointing out the error in their thinking. And I got thousands of comments, many of them negative, about my not understanding women, and I got comments from women thanking me, saying that's why I don't talk to men about my feelings. But it was an interesting experiment, kind of like I never thought I would get a response like that. So how do parents teach kids about emotion? So Gottman, in one of his books and articles, describes the dismissive strategy, to deny how important those emotions are, how important what happened. Oh, that's not important, don't worry about it. So some people actually, oh, my mother was supportive. What did she say? Oh, that's not important, don't worry about it. Is that really respectful of your emotion? I had a patient a number of years ago she was engaged. She and her husband worked at the World Trade Center. She was late for work, and she was in New Jersey, and she looked out the window talking to her husband on the phone as the building was about to collapse. And you can imagine how awful that is, how unbelievably incomprehensible, inconsolable experience that must be. And about a year later, she was on a cruise. She thought a cruise would be helpful, and she was talking to some people, and they said, well, you're a young woman, you'll get over it. She was enraged. You'll get over it. So the disapproving style is another style that doesn't work, which is to criticize, try to control others. Stop feeling that way, stop crying. Or the dysregulated parent, I'm overwhelmed with my own issues, why are you bothering me with this? Or emotional coaching, which sounds like Carl Rogers, which is a good style. Assist the child in expressing their emotion, identifying their emotions, differentiating the emotions. Sounds like you feel this way and that way, and help engage in problem solving. It teaches kids how to interact, how to deal with their emotions, and kids who have parents like that are better at not only handling their own emotions, but also better at dealing with other kids. It's kind of an emotional intelligence element. So there are negative emotions that we get. And you may not only get this when you're a kid, you may get this from your partner or from other people in your life. If you cry, you're weak. If you're afraid, you're a coward. If you're sad, you are selfish. Why should you be sad? You have it better than other kids. You shouldn't feel upset because you have things so much better. You have no right to those feelings. You're making me upset with your crying. Stop crying, you're upsetting me. Other kids are able to handle things, why can't you? Get over it. You know, the history of get over it is not a good history. It's not like, oh, get over it, that made me feel better. Grow up. Stop bothering me with this. Can't you see I have my own problems? You don't make any sense. You just go on and on. I can't stand listening to you. Now some of this, as those of you who are familiar with the Gottman method, some of you know this is very common in marital interactions. But these are negative messages that lead to negative beliefs about your own emotion and how people will respond. So I want you to think about yourself right now. You don't have to disclose anything. But when you were a child, which parent would you turn to? And what would they say or do? What would your father say? What would your mother say when you were upset? And how did this make you feel? What did it make you think? Why would you not turn to the other parent? Or think about how people respond when somebody's upset. What can I do? Well, you can stop crying, and then we can have a discussion. How many of you seen that kind of reaction that some people might have to emotion? Stop crying. There's a famous book of essays by Unamuno, written about 1920s, Spanish existential philosopher, novelist, poet. And one of his essays is called The Tragic Sense of Life. And he contrasts the modern man, which is like being rational and solving problems, with the tragic vision, which is, horrible things happen and you're a witness to it. And he tells a story, actually, that comes from famous Greek leader Solon in the 5th century BC. An old man is sitting by the side of the road and he's crying. And a young man comes along who represents a modern man. Young man says, "Old man, why are you crying?" And the old man says, "I'm crying over the death of my son. My son has died." The young man says, "Why do you cry? Crying avails nothing. Crying won't help. Why do you cry?" The old man says, "I cry because I know that crying avails nothing." And Unamuno goes on and he says, we must learn how to weep for the plague, not just cure it. It's very compassionate. It's like being a witness and joining and connecting with the suffering. But people come to therapy for many reasons, but two main reasons. One is to have a safe place to fall apart, and the other is to have a place to be put back together And many times in therapy, we sometimes in CBT will jump to those solutions and techniques where maybe what that person needs right now is a safe place to fall apart. So what are the problematic beliefs about emotion that we learned in childhood? My emotions don't make any sense. I'm weak and childish. No one understands me. These are beliefs that carry on in our lives. My emotions are a burden to other people. Other people don't feel this way. My emotions are so abnormal. I don't have a right to these feelings. No one cares about my emotions. I'll be punished for my feelings. I should stop feeling this way. My emotions disgust other people. How many of you have clients who have experienced these kinds of thoughts about their emotions? Shame and guilt and confusion, lack of acceptance. Think about who you would feel comfortable crying in front of. Yourself. Who would you feel, okay, I can let myself go, and if I'm upset, I can cry in front of them? What thoughts would you have if you cried in front of another person that you feel uncomfortable with? That they're judging me, they think I'm weak, they think I'm out of control? Who would feel comfortable crying in front of you? I had a patient a number of years ago who had 3 children. She was a very loving, attentive mother, but came from a family where she was invalidated growing up on a continual basis. But she so much needed that validation and connection. And she came in one day and she said, I think I'm losing control. I was at a movie, and the movie We Were Soldiers Once with Mel Gibson. Has anybody here seen that movie? So it's about Mel Gibson as an officer in the Vietnam War, and he's going to Vietnam, and you know from the storyline that he's going to die. And he's saying goodbye, just saying goodbye to his family. And she said, at that scene, I said, what scene did you cry at? She said, that scene, I was crying. And I felt so ashamed, I felt like people were looking at me thinking, I'm a grown-up, why am I crying at that scene? I said, if you were the director, you saw somebody in the front row crying at that scene, what would you think about her? Oh, I don't know what you would think about me. I said, I think you got it. You got what that scene was all about, what this movie is all about. You cried for the right reason. I had a patient a number of years ago who told me, I don't know what's wrong with my life. I have a good job, I make a lot of money, I have dates whenever I want, but I just feel like something's really missing. And I said to him, who needs you? And he broke down crying. He said, nobody needs me. Nobody needs me. He said, I've designed my life so that nobody relies on me, so I'm completely free. He said, I haven't cried since I was a child. And I said, how sad not to have something worth crying over. Not having something worth crying over. How many of you have cried as an adult? Right? You had something that mattered. But the attitude that many people have learned is that crying is something you should never do. Never do in front of anybody. It's not an adult thing to do. So part of, I think, good therapy, whether it's CBT or any kind of therapy, is validation. It's very easy to invalidate people and dismiss it and put everything in perspective. I've learned the hard way that that's not the way to go. When I first began doing cognitive therapy, I was relentless technique-oriented, one technique after another. And it worked for some people, patients who had strong egos or whatever, but For some people, it was like, oh, hold on, I need to tell my story. It's interesting that the word cry is similar to the meaning of crying out to somebody, calling out and connecting for help. So validation, standing back to imagine if this were you. Think about if you had experienced what this person has experienced, coming in to see a total stranger and then sharing their story. What failures in trust has this person experienced in their lives? There are micro skills, noticing the details, noticing the inflection in the voice, the nonverbal gestures, the pacing, the hesitation, using your own feelings to validate the person. How sad. I had a patient a number of years ago who described his family history. His mother and father met when they were 14 years old in Vienna, before the Nazis took over. And then the Nazis came in, and his family and her family, parts of her family, were able to get out, crossing the Soviet Union, Japan, eventually coming to America. And the father, when he was 18, volunteered and went back to Europe and fought for the US Army. As he told this story, I began crying. I felt like, my God, what a horrible experience. The Holocaust. How do you think the patient felt? He actually felt, I got it. It wasn't intentional. It was just simply horrible. But even when we validate people, we have to accept what Gottman, who's a psychoanalyst, object relations, described as empathic failures. We're going to fail at times to communicate that we get it. And we have to be ready for that. And actually helping the patient understand that we're going to fail in empathizing or validating. I had a patient who said to me, who had several suicide attempts, and her father was a very invalidating person, and I was into my technique fetish, and trying to get her to do behavioral activation, put things in perspective, say positive things about herself and all this. Every session failing more and more. And she said to me, Dr. Leahy, you just don't get it. You don't understand what it's like for me. So I then said, well, I think it's very difficult. You get upset, kind of more validating. Then I went home and I thought, what is it like for her? And how can I say I understand what it's like for her? So I came back the next session and I said, I try to think about when I say I understand what it's like for you, but I can tell you that I've never been depressed like you have. The only times I've felt depressed were after a breakup with a girlfriend in the past for maybe a week or 2 weeks or something, but nothing like what you experience. And even that seemed unbearable to me. But what you experience is beyond my understanding, beyond my experience. And she said, now you understand. So in a way, it was kind of like joining with her about the empathic failure, that I don't understand, which means I understand I don't understand. And maybe I can trust this person who knows he doesn't understand. We have two contrasting views of emotion. We have a Darwinian view that emotions are kind of built in, innate predispositions, that there are modules for adaptation, like panic disorder, maybe a module for escaping from threatening an open space or a closed space. Anxieties and fears protect, like the fear of heights is adaptive, the fear of strangers is adaptive, the fear of the dark is adaptive for children. There's a universal recognition of facial expressions, so there may be some built-in predispositions about how emotions are expressed and how we read those emotions. So the Darwinian approach, I think, has a lot of value. But there's also a cognitive part of emotion, which is, I would call the social construction model. So for example, we have historical and cultural differences in how people express emotion. So let's take me. Even though my name Leahy is as Irish as it gets, and my face is as Irish, I look like an Irish cop on South Boston. I was raised 100% Italian. My mother was Italian, raised Italian. How many of you are Italian or Jewish at some point in your ancestry, right? So you get it, right? So in my Italian family, on Sunday dinner, you go to your nonnies and you have to kiss everybody, and you have to kiss your aunts, and you have to kiss your uncles, your grandparents, kiss the furniture, everything. You know, it's like everything is like affection. Oh, Roberto, you're so cute. You know, so it was all like, you know, emotion, expression, the whole thing. But there are definitely cultural differences in the expression of emotion. For example, in touching, like they actually did a study observing two men having lunch in a restaurant and filming them and how many times they touched each other in the course of an hour and a half. So I don't know what the exact numbers are, but the magnitude you'll get. So observing two Italians or two Spanish people in Spain, whatever, two men, you know, maybe they touch each other 150 times, an hour and a half, you know, and watching two British men having lunch 0 times. So I think it explains a lot. But, so what we learn in our culture, the rules for emotion display, nonverbal, inflection, touching, proximity, closeness, making eye contact, hugging. I have a good friend from Istanbul, Mehmet, who is Turkish, and every time I see him, you know, hugs me, kisses me on both cheeks. I have a Russian friend, Dmitry, very prominent psychiatrist, and you know, every time he sees me, he's from St. Petersburg, he says, Robert, so good to see you. You know, very affectionate, very warm. But there's a great variation ethnically, culturally, in the expression of emotion. And there are also different communities where we feel certain emotions. In this context, it's okay to show emotion, other contexts not. You can even look at historical changes in how emotion has been viewed. So during the Enlightenment, especially in Scotland, in England, there was a great deal of emphasis on rationality, facts, social engineering, being stoic. Then there was a rebellion, a romantic rebellion, which was an emphasis on the intensity of the emotion, the expression of emotion, authenticity, having intimate connection and passion. Growing out of that, there was a movement called sentimentalism. Has anybody heard of sentimentalism? Most people have never heard of it. But it was a movement that was common in the 18th century in England and in France. And the sentimentalist movement, sort of like an outgrowth of the intense passion of romanticism, was that if you really felt something strongly, you would be crying. So if you really loved this woman, or man, but if you really loved this woman, you would express your devotion to her while you're weeping. Members of the House of Lords, which is about as waspish as it gets, that they would, in order to advance their passion for the bill, they would be weeping, be crying that they really believed this. So sentimentalism was a widespread emotion movement in the 18th century, but then the French Revolution came around, and the English began thinking, well, wait a second, this emotion stuff has gone a little bit too far, where you're chopping off heads, so we're now going to pull back, and now we're going to have Victorian self-control. Of course, nobody said that on Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock in London, but that's what happened. So you had a pullback into Victorian self-control, and then the emphasis on the stiff upper lip, being in control, not showing emotion, not showing you're upset, not showing your vulnerability. I would argue as well that part of this emphasis on self-control of emotion is also very common in imperialistic cultures, because if you want to enslave people, like the southern gentleman of the 18th century who had slaves, he had to show that he had no vulnerability, that he could be severe and not have any vulnerability or any weakness. And the same thing with British imperialism. Then in the 20th century, in America, and to some extent in England, we moved toward emotional protection. Some of this grew out of the psychoanalytic movements, where everything became a trigger for anxiety or difficulty, and Benjamin Spock, and protect your child from being upset. And we even have the current overprotection, maybe in some cases carried too far, with trigger warnings and the culture of victimhood for some people, and a culture of complaint and existential entitlement and all this. Now, one concept in my model is existential perfectionism, which means that your life should be fulfilling all the time. I should only be doing what I want to do. That's pretty good. I should be happy all the time. My work should never be boring. How many of you have lives like that on a daily basis? Anybody here? Because I want to use you as a role model. I don't know anybody who has this kind of life. Or thinking that my partner every morning that they wake up should tell me how grateful they are to be with me. Anybody have a partner like that? I don't know anybody. But it would be wonderful if everything went exactly your way. And so you have this kind of existential perfectionistic idea. To think about our ancestors, 100, 200 years ago. I don't think people were thinking this way. And the Constantinople wagons and people landing on the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, and being examined, being humiliated by people who thought they were inferior because they were not part of the Brahmin class in Boston. So the victim culture, everybody feeling like, oh my God, I'm not treated fairly. Now certainly some people are terribly treated, and there's tremendous racism and sexism and homophobia and all kinds of difficulties. But there's some of us really get so caught up in collecting injury. There's also, the work in social psychology seems to demonstrate, by Jean Twenge and other people, an increase in narcissism among younger people. Now younger people now are people under 30, but measures of narcissism and entitlement have increased in the last 25 years for young people. Everybody being told how wonderful they are. The Department of Self-Esteem in California. So think about the historical changes in the attitudes about jealousy. So in the 17th century, there was a rise of jealousy. And the jealousy 17th century was also in the 17th, 18th century. It was an honor culture. It's a culture focused on honor. So if somebody was flirting with your female partner, you would feel insulted. Your honor would be insulted, and you would think that you had to defend your honor, perhaps by going and fighting a duel. The shifted attitude about jealousy in the 19th century toward the Victorian family, emphasizing harmony, everything being wonderful, and jealousy being disparaged. So at the same time, during this Victorian period, you had an incredible rise of prostitution. So you had this compartmentalized way of life in London, for example, where you'd have these gentlemen who go to these men's clubs and are very well dressed in their tweed suits, and going to church every Sunday and being pillars of the community. seeing prostitutes over here, or having an affair with somebody over here. So the Victorian family, though, had to give the appearance of harmony. And in fact, intense emotion, like anger or jealousy, was not allowed. 20th century, latter part of the 20th century, women's liberation movement, and jealousy became disparaged. So the emotional schema model is a social cognitive model of emotion. It's a model of how we think about emotion, how we think what we think causes our emotion, how we deal with the emotion. So emotion is a personal and interpersonal phenomenon. So my emotions and your emotions together. They're elicited by appraisals, many times. It's consistent with the Becky model. But also your concepts of emotion, your ideas about emotion, also have cognitive biases. Like it's terrible that I'm jealous, or my anger is going to go on forever, or, she is neurotic, because she has emotions, or he has emotions. And so we maintain beliefs about the causes of emotion. You're like that because your father was like that, or because you have a chemical imbalance, or because you're a crazy person. How legitimate those emotions are. You don't have any right to be jealous or envious. Beliefs about duration or durability, those emotions are just going to keep going on. Control, you have no control, you have to have all control. How dangerous those emotions are. And how to manage the emotion. Suppress the emotion, express the emotion, numb the emotion. It's how we view the emotions of ourselves and others. So I have a short questionnaire that we've given to several hundred patients, cohabiting or married, asking you, how does your partner respond to your emotion? So there are 14 questions. Each question evaluates one dimension. I'll just give you an example of a few. Does your partner think your emotions go on indefinitely? Does your partner blame you for your emotions? Does your partner think your emotions don't make sense? Does your partner think you should only feel one way? So no tolerance or ambivalence. Does your partner think other people have those emotions? Does your partner think you should be rational all the time? Does your partner discourage you from expressing your emotion? So 14 questions. And the correlation between that and marital dissatisfaction, or relationship dissatisfaction, is about 0.5. Very high correlation. Even when you factor out depression, very high correlation. So think about it. If your partner said the opposite, said, well, I can completely understand that you feel that way. Tell me more about it. I can see why that would make sense. Maybe linking your emotions to your partner's values. Well, you're a very conscientious person and you're trying to work hard and you're not being treated fairly, so it's understandable that with those values that would matter to you. A lot of other people would have those feelings. But there's also a whole range of feelings that you've had. You're capable of many feelings. Your emotions make sense. It's not important to be rational, it's important to be understood. How would that sound? Think about how many marriages would be saved if once every 5 years somebody said something like that. So this is certainly consistent, I think, with the Gottman model, or the emotion-focused therapy model by Les Greenberg. But you think about how you think about your partner's emotion, or how they think about your emotion. It makes a world of difference. There are also social cognitive factors in how we predict emotion. So we may over-predict emotion, called affective forecasting. I'm going to feel terrible we focus on one element and think that's going to determine everything. We exaggerate the impact that an event's going to have. So if this happens, I'm going to be really upset, or I'm going to be really happy forever. We think that our emotions are going to last a really long time, whereas in reality they don't last a long time. We ignore the idea that we may actually have good coping strategies to use. We emphasize present events rather than future. So this is a model of two men who, or it could be two women, whatever, but let's say they're both having a 5-month relationship with one with Susan, the other one with Carol. And so let me see. The guy's name is Nate, but it's not Nate. It's not you, Nate. So I'm not referring to you. That's the name I use because I like to call Nate the neurotic, but that's not this one. This is Nate the Mensch. So Nate the neurotic, you know, he gets a text message from Susan after 4 months in the relationship up down, saying that she wants to break up, never contact me again, it's not going to work out, forget it. So he feels angry, he feels anxious, he has sexual fantasies about her, he feels sad, and he labels these emotions if he's not alexithymate. And he thinks that these emotions are emotions he has to avoid, he has to get rid of them. So he dissociates, he tries to numb himself, he binges on alcohol and food and drugs. He just wants to get rid of the emotion because he thinks that if I have these emotions, they'll go out of control, they'll last a long time. He has negative interpretations. He feels guilty or ashamed about the emotion. He thinks other people would not have these feelings. He has a simplistic view, it should only feel one way. His emotions are incomprehensible. Does it make sense I have all these emotions? He can't accept the emotion. And he thinks he should be rational all the time. So this leads him to think that emotions are problematic, have to avoid them, and then he may ruminate or worry or avoid situations or blame other people. On the other hand, Michael the Mensch, I'm sorry, I could have seen it's the alliteration, it's the poet. So Michael the Mensch, all these emotions are normal, he thinks. And then he has a friend who he can talk to, Vincent the Validator. I'm on a roll here. Who encourages him to express his feelings and validates him. He can accept his feelings because he is a Mensch. He can link his emotions to the values and having a good relationship and intimacy, and he can learn from the experience. Both of these people have the same emotions, but they have different thoughts about those emotions and different ways of dealing with them. And it's the person who has these negative interpretations of emotion and uses problematic strategies. And by the way, these beliefs about emotions are related to problematic strategies in our research and research of other people. So there are a lot of strategies of emotion regulation. Some of them, the ones in yellow, are problematic, like using drugs or alcohol, avoiding situations, trying to suppress the emotion, oh, don't feel that way. Trying to distract yourself, like put it in a little bit of gray, because that can't always work. You can't spend your life distracted. Where's Dr. Shapiro, who's the expert, superlative Shapiro, the expert on ADHD. Worry and rumination is a way of avoiding emotion. But more helpful strategy, actually social support is a very useful strategy for emotion. We tend to overlook that in CBT. Behavioral activation, getting out and doing things, cognitive restructuring, thinking about things differently, problem solving, Nezu's work, reducing arousal using meditation, relaxation, medication, acceptance, and also modifying your beliefs about emotion, your theories about emotion, your beliefs about how durable emotions are. So one part of emotional perfectionism is the idea of pure mind. Very similar to how people with OCD think about their intrusive thoughts. So my thoughts and my feelings should be clear all the time. How many of you have thoughts and feelings clear all the time? Anybody here? Nobody. They should only be in one direction. They should be univalent. They should always be positive. Contradictions cannot be tolerated. Oh, I can't stand ambivalence. And patients, oh, how can I get married if I'm ambivalent? I said, if you get married, you'll be more ambivalent after. You actually know the person. You know, it's like the existential perfectionism about Romeo and Juliet. You know, oh, Romeo, wherefore art thou? And, you know, can you imagine Romeo and Juliet being married for 25 years? You know, this crap, wherefore art thou? I'm right here. I made the pancakes, now eat them. You know, so this kind of idealization about romance and life really sets people up for disappointment, which of course is part of the emotional perfectionism. I should never be disappointed. The idea that there are good thoughts and bad thoughts, good feelings, or that you have to control your thoughts and your feelings. Oh, that's a bad emotion. Like envy. Envy is where you feel annoyed that somebody's doing better than you're doing. Envy is the emotion, in some research, that people are most ashamed of. Most ashamed of envy. Oh, I shouldn't feel envy. I shouldn't tell anybody I'm envious. How many of you ever felt envious? Because you raised your hands before, if you have freedom of hands. Yeah, so envy is a universal emotion. Most cultures have the evil eye. You go to Middle Eastern cultures, oh, they invented the evil eye. You go to African cultures, oh, they invented the evil eye. Eastern Europe, evil eye everywhere. Evil eye is, don't say anything too good because then people will look at you. The word envy comes from invidere in Latin, to look upon. They will look at you with envy and want to destroy you. In fact, if you're a Orthodox person, you might, or a devout Muslim, you might say, you know, God willing, that, you know, you don't want to say I'm going to do this. You want to say, oh, if God wants me to do this, because then it's sort of like I'm actually putting myself on the same level as God. But that's an interesting attitude about envy. It's universal, and we're ashamed of it and afraid of it. So think about the mind as a kaleidoscope filled with chaos, intrusions, and noise. How many of you have noisy, chaotic minds at times? Because you're all crazy. So I think about the upside of the downside. All emotions evolved because they were adaptive. All the emotions, jealousy, envy, even boredom, ambivalence, regret. I'm working on a book on regret now because I think that's a powerful emotion. I reject the idea of good and bad emotions. It's like, that's just part of being a human being. I reject the idea of higher and lower self because it's the self. All of that's part of you. It's like saying, okay, I value my heart and I respect my heart, but I don't value my lungs and the intestines I think are disgusting. I want to get rid of them. You need all of it. I think about relationships, about living in the emotional landscape of your lives together. That both of you and your partner are crossing a very complex, challenging landscape. And there are going to be ups and downs and disappointments and resentments, stupid things that will be said. It's like the patient once, oh, my wife said something irrational. So why does it bother you? What are you talking about? This is cognitive therapy. I said, why? No, how can you have a discussion with somebody who's irrational? I said, I do that every hour of the week. And a lot of times I'm talking to myself, by the way. But it's like, because you think it's rational to think your wife is going to be rational all the time? I said, what if you actually had this acceptance model that you compartmentalize every day, you or your wife will say something stupid and unfair. And you say, oh, okay, that's part of being married. That'd be a lot easier. You say, oh, yeah, somebody has baggage. everybody has baggage, or they're going to acquire baggage. The question is it carry on baggage? So, there was a book a number of years ago called I'm Okay, You're Okay. It's bullshit. Nobody really believes that. Nobody believes you're okay. You're kidding. Stand in front of a mirror. Oh, I'm okay, I'm okay. No, you're an idiot. You're standing in front of a mirror talking to yourself. You should get a cat. The cat will understand you. I was thinking about a better book, more realistic. I'm not okay, you're not okay, but that's okay. So, normalizing the abnormal. Everyone is disappointed at times about something. Does anybody here think that they'll be disappointed again in the future? Good, so you won't be disappointed. No one gets exactly what they want. Oh, that's not what I wanted. The model is about acceptance and containment, being able to contain, I have these unpleasant emotions at times. It just simply comes with the territory. No one is that good. I always like, like people walking very slowly, pondering the meaning of life. I just want to give them a kick in the ass and get them off the stage. You don't have to walk that, you're not that holy. I'm not going to be able to get through all of this, that's for sure. But coping with ambivalence, that some thoughts about ambivalence are that it's either all good or all bad. So, should I get married to this person or not? It has to be all good for me to say yes. It's a matter of trade-offs. Labeling. This is an unacceptable alternative or a bad choice, as opposed to it's a choice with trade-offs. Discounting any positives. Those positives are not important. If they were not important, you wouldn't have any ambivalence. Negative filtering, focusing primarily on the negative. Fortune telling, it's going to lead to a bad outcome. If I'm ambivalent, it's going to lead to a bad outcome. Catastrophizing, the outcome would be unbearable. Or it's catastrophic that I'm ambivalent. Wouldn't it be great if you were in college, you took a course on Ambivalence 101, and the only grade you can get is incomplete? So, I had a patient who was ambivalent, divorced guy. And he said, what's the secret to dealing with a relationship where it's ambivalent? I said, I used to do a lot of windsurfing. Anybody here ever do windsurfing? You get on a surfboard with things. So you get this. So I went down to St. John. Lindsay knows where St. John is in the Virgin Islands. I went over to Coral Bay, the windy side. Talked to Mike, who's the hot dog windsurfer on the island. I said, Mike, I want to learn how to windsurf in heavy waves and heavy winds. And I remember one time I was in Aruba and I went over and wanted to get a windsurfer. They said there are small craft warnings. So they wouldn't let me take out a sailboat. And I said, can I take out a windsurfer? I said, it's not a boat. So I went out, it was like 28 miles an hour. It's like being on the edge of death and being excited. Anyway, so I went over to Coral Bay, and Mike, who's like this real hot dog guy, and hey, like a white guy from Boston with dreadnoughts, picture. And so I said, what's the key? He said, Bob, it's rock and roll and commit to the action. And that's what I said, that's what relationships are like. So if you think, and so this guy actually put on his screensaver, he had a picture of a guy windsurfing, rock and roll and commit to the action. That's what life is like. I can't stand sailing or windsurfing like the wind is 5 miles an hour. It's pathetic. I'd rather be buried alive. So rock and roll and commit to the action. So the existential perfectionism doesn't accept any of that. They want the ideal life. They're entitled to it. They can't stand any frustration. They demand things on their terms. Overgeneralized complaints. They have what I would call dissatisfaction syndrome, which is much harder to treat than panic disorder. Nobody comes in and says, I'm dissatisfied And what I want you to do is to help me be satisfied with things exactly the way they are. Has anybody had a patient like that? That person doesn't exist. I'm dissatisfied and I have a right to my dissatisfaction. And I'm going to be dissatisfied until I get everything I want on my terms, which involves people close to me agreeing with everything I say. They have receding reference points. This is a concept that Albert Ellis came up with years ago, which is that whatever you achieve, you want more, you want more, you want more, you want more. So you're in fact, I've actually had patients, I ask them, what if I could wave a wand and you could become satisfied with the way things are? Would you want to be satisfied? No, I don't want to be satisfied. Why not? Because that would make me a loser. That would make me mediocre. I would lose my edge. It's also the idea that somehow I should never be disillusioned. Has anybody here ever been disillusioned beside me? People get disillusioned about religion, about romance, about jobs, about theories or friends, whatever. Disillusionment, let's break it down. What does it mean? You had an illusion. Well, I'd rather continue with my illusions, thank you very much. So anyway, the jealousy cures, my recent book, I won't go through too much of this because we're almost out of time, but there are different kinds of jealousy. Sibling rivalry, child-parent relationships. My father likes my brother and my sister, but more than me. Friendships, colleagues, jealousy in relationships with colleagues. This person's getting more attention. Intimate partner jealousy. Retrospective jealousy. Jealousy about your partner's past partner. I'm going to skip over the evolutionary model, but there are ways in which jealousy exhibits itself in what I would call safety behaviors, like checking the phone or text messages, email, stalking, interrogating, looking for clues, seeking reassurance, pouting and withdrawing. Why are you pouting? No, it's nothing. Nobody says the ultimate passive-aggressive reveal. I'm pouting, and the reason I'm pouting, in fact, I plan to pout later on this afternoon at 3 o'clock. I'm going to make an appointment to pout in front of you in order to make you feel confused and guilty about the way I feel. And I won't let you soothe me so that you'll be even more confused. That's what I get joy from. So, what's the treatment for it? One thing is normalizing jealousy. It's a universal phenomenon. They've actually done research on pets. Dogs, highest in jealousy. Horses, second. Horses, let's think about that. I'm jealous of other horses. Cats, lower down, because cats are self-contained. Ask around. Normalize jealousy by asking around. Do you know other people who are jealous? Yeah. A patient once said, oh my God, my boyfriend had dinner the other night with his ex-girlfriend. I was so upset and jealous, and he told me I was crazy. I said, why does it bother you that you were jealous? She said, I don't want to be that crazy girlfriend who's jealous. I said, have you talked to your other girlfriends if they would feel jealous if their boyfriend had dinner with an ex-girlfriend? Oh, they all thought they would be jealous. They thought he was a jerk, in fact. Now, maybe he's not a jerk, but if a lot of your friends would feel jealous, maybe it's a pretty normal emotion. Sometimes there could be legitimate reasons for somebody being jealous. Sometimes people think that I should never feel this way, I should just tolerate anything. But maybe sometimes being assertive is a way of exercising your rights. In fact, the old idea that people are jealous only because of low self-esteem is not borne out by the research. There are conflicting findings. So sometimes self-esteem is related to jealousy, sometimes it's not. And it could be that sometimes somebody is at higher self-esteem, and they say, no one's going to treat me that way. So it's not reducible to self-esteem or irrationality. What would it mean to you if your partner claimed he or she would never feel jealous? Some people might think maybe they didn't love me enough. So in fact, in some relationships, one partner will try to elicit jealousy in the other to see if the other person really matters. In fact, in some studies, one study that was done, they actually found that when there was expression of jealousy early in the relationship, that relationship was more long-lasting than ones in which there was no jealousy experienced. So I would validate the jealousy. You're not alone. Validate the difficulty in coping, related to the fear, related to values of commitment and honesty, and making room for jealousy. So what if you were to think about your relationship as this large, complicated room, called the relationship room? And in this room, all these objects in the room are experiences and memories, feelings and thoughts, future things that you do together. And jealousy is one object in that room. You decide, I'm going to leave that, I'm going to make room for that jealousy. Our relationship is large enough for that jealousy. You can accept it without acting on it. You can think about going through the landscape of your emotions. Like here, we're walking through a cave together, and the cave is our relationship, and maybe we're holding a candle, and the candle is jealousy. We're in this together. You can think about a case conceptualization of jealousy beginning with evolutionary origins, childhood history of attachment issues, threats to abandonment, core beliefs about self and others, like I'm not good enough, or the other person can't be trusted. Relationship history. If you had relationships with people who continue to abandon and cheat on you, you're probably more likely to be jealous. Situational triggers, like, contact from an ex-girlfriend or a movie you see with someone having an affair, activates hypervigilance, perceived threat to a relationship. Many things are now viewed as threats. Demands for certainty. I need to know for sure how my partner feels. Emotional schemas, like I shouldn't feel this way, my jealousies, I am my jealousy. Hedging. Some people are jealous, then straddle and have another relationship, keep their options open. Trying to control the partner, trying to provoke or punish or devalue the partner or devalue the competition. Trying to get reassurance that doesn't always work, because you might think the person is just, trying to placate you. And then increase relationship conflict, which then activates insecurity, which then leads to vulnerability and more jealousy. So we make a distinction between jealous thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, like you would with OCD, with thought-action fusion. I can have a jealous thought without actually, it doesn't mean that something real is happening. My thoughts are not the same thing as reality. I can feel jealous, it doesn't mean that something is happening. It doesn't mean I have to do something. It may be that my response to my jealousy might be the biggest problem. It's possible my jealousy may rise and fall. I don't need to control my jealousy, I need to control my actions. Safety behaviors, are they really making me feel safe? The common cognitive distortions in the jealous mind, like mind reading, taking things personally, fortune telling. I mentioned the thought-action fusion, the idea that I have to act on the feelings. The idea that jealousy is unique to me. Acceptance of jealousy as part of intimate connection. Thinking about reducing the negative effect on the partner. Acknowledging that you have a jealousy problem. Validating it has a negative effect on the partner. I can see this is hard for you. Directing compassion toward the partner about whom you feel jealous. Ask for direction when I'm feeling jealous. How should I talk about it? What should I do? What should we do? See if the accused partner can validate and comfort them. Very hard thing. Because when you're being accused, you don't want to validate, show compassion, which might be the ultimate technique. and reach agreement that you can feel jealous without taking action. All of this is discussed in the book, The Jealousy Cure. So you can have the partners role-play compassion toward each other. And think about jealousy as a threat to the attachment relationship, where the response of the jealous partner is to often attack the focus of attachment. So it becomes actually self-defeating and self-fulfilling, that you get rejected for the actions of jealousy, the threats and interrogation and all that. But what if you then changed the narrative between the two, and it became one of sharing compassion for each other? It must be hard for you, feeling jealous, and think about how hard it is for someone who's jealous, and it may be very difficult for you to be the target of the jealousy. Also, decatastrophizing loss. Like many people who are jealous, the research shows if somebody believes that they have no possibility of finding a desirable partner, they're much more likely to feel jealous and to suffer from that jealousy. So thinking about what would my life be like if I were not with this partner, because sometimes relationships don't last. And that can help, build, expand your social support, diversify your valued action in life, and so forth. Could loss create new opportunities? Let me shift finally to think about clarifying values. So part of the emotional schema model, not inconsistent with other models like that. But what I want you to think about is taking it all away. I had a patient a number of years ago who his business partner cheated him out of a lot of money. He was understandably very angry, drinking, irritable, and he had 3 daughters. And I said, okay, so completely acknowledge it was an unfair thing to do. But I want you to set aside the anger for a moment. And what I want you to think about is imagine everything has been taken away. Everything, your eyesight, your hearing, your body, your family, your money, everything has been taken away, your memory, everything. You have nothing. And now, I'm going to play God, and I know it's miscasting, but I'm going to play God. And what I want you to do, I'll give you back one thing at a time, but the only way you're going to get it back is if you can convince me that you really appreciate it. So suddenly he became very quiet and then tearful, and he said, I want my daughters back. I said, which one do you want first? He said, do I have to choose? I said, no, it's not Sophie's choice. But your response is a good one. Let's take your oldest daughter. What do you appreciate? And he went through things he really appreciated about her, including the difficulties that they had. Went through each daughter, then he shifted to his wife. And I said, don't forget now, you haven't gotten your eyesight back, have you? Oh yeah, I want my eyesight back. What do you want to see? I want to see my family. What do you want to see? What's a memory, a visual image? Now he's beginning to think about that. This is like tearful. And I said, okay, your homework assignment over the next week, you can either be pissed off and ruminate about the money, or you can make your wife and your 3 daughters feel loved and appreciated. So he came back and he said, this is so helpful to him. I said, you had all of that without the money that you got cheated out of. But because you got so focused on the anger, you forgot about what was right in front of you. So you had to make a case of appreciation. But think about your life, you out here, and think about how it could have been different. Think about how accidental you are. Think about your great-grandparents had to meet, they had to have sex, they had to procreate at that particular moment. They had your parents, you had to be born, you had to survive, all the doctors and nurses and people, everything that made you possible, that it seems like such a low probability, it's absolutely incredible that you exist. Think about that. You are a complete accident. I think also observing other people, like I walk to work and I observe and I see people, with their baby carriages and people with walkers and people who are homeless, and observe other people and think about how life can be so difficult for other people. Or imagine traveling to the future, to your future self, and looking back at your life now and what you would want to do differently so that that future self is going to be a happy self. Or imagine practicing the negative. These are Stoic techniques from a couple of thousand years ago, which think about practicing the negative. Think about your fear of poverty. I grew up in poverty. I grew up in a housing project. We were on welfare. I was talking to a friend of mine today. He was talking about vacations, he said. I said to myself, when I was a kid, not only we never went on a vacation, we actually never went to a restaurant. And I didn't feel deprived. But I think about, imagine something that you're worried about, and we take it away. Take away some money, whatever it is. Where could you get satisfaction? Or imagine that your partner no longer exists. What would you miss? Imagine you don't have your eyesight, or you can't hear. This is a very ancient Stoic technique, which is actually to practice poverty, to practice discomfort, to practice loneliness. Think about what could make you cry. Maybe you see the meaning of your life through your tears. Maybe it's a revelation that that thing matters to you. About how sad it is for that man, as an adult, to never have something worth crying over. Has anybody ever seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life? Jimmy Stewart? Imagine if you never existed, whose lives would have been worse off? Your kids, friends, family, all the people who maybe never got around to saying, I'm grateful for what you've done, but that you've mattered. Anyway, thank you for coming. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Yes?
Thank you for talking. It was very lovely. I'm wondering how the model accounts for oppression that is outside the relational framework. So a lot of this works if you can have an interpersonal dialogue with someone, or maybe you can choose to leave a relationship or to negotiate it. But
What is the person depressed about?
Oppression.
Oppression.
Yes. So something I hear a lot from clients who live marginalized experiences. Sure. Is that it's one thing to do this work in therapy, but then you go out into a world that very concretely does devalue you, or does devalue your emotion, or does devalue your work, and you have to live in that world every day. You can't just have a conversation or leave the relationship of society. And I wonder how you would negotiate that within this model.
Well, I think the emotion that you're talking about is feeling pissed off.
Yeah, I was thinking about rage as that wasn't in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Aristotle. Take, let's say, anger. It's to be angry for the right reasons, in the right proportion, in the right way, at the right time. So, racism, or all these, homophobia, or oppressive things that people do, like Donald Trump is pissing me off. But being angry about the right thing, it's kind of rather than thinking that anger is a bad thing,
righteous emotion that leads to struggles for social justice. And so, in a way, it's kind of like, I don't feel bad about myself that I'm angry at Donald Trump or, Putin or other, tyrants. I just think that that's a good thing. I'm angry. I should be angry. I want to be angry. Right? So, the people who are oppressing us, or you or somebody else, legitimate emotions being angry, then the question would be, to what extent do you want that to envelop you? You want to get hijacked by it? Does that become the emotion that dominates your life experience? And so I think finding, one way I think about, like we talk about the oppressive world, whatever, that sounds very generalized. And I understand what you're saying. I think I understand what you're saying. But I like to think about life as a portfolio, not a financial portfolio, but like little segments of that pie, the life portfolio pie, which is your relationship with your friends, your partner, your kids, your work, spiritual, community, aspirations, memories, all these things. And I think nobody can take away those things from you that are part of your life portfolio. So it's having an enriched, like I grew up very poor, and I didn't feel depressed, and I didn't feel hopeless, and I didn't feel like a victim. Now I look back and say, oh shit. But I kind of think, all right, so yeah, I wanted to get out of here. So I think having, even people who are oppressed or poor or disabled or having difficulty, that doesn't make them pathetic. It could be that becomes a challenge then to overcome and to become empowered. And I know it's not easy. I think a lot of American psychology wants to make believe that life is easy. Just do this and you'll be fine. It's like, you'll be okay. What we have to think about is life is not okay a lot of times. I respect the work of Albert Ellis to some extent, to a large extent. But one thing he said that makes me uncomfortable, nothing is awful. I don't agree. Actually, the word awful comes from the English derivation of it, the way it was used in the 19th century. It means something that elicited your awe. Like you, oh my God, that's incredible. Yeah, so life sometimes can be awful, that terrible things, unfair things happen. The Holocaust was awful. A lot of things in life. Terminal cancer is awful. Losing anybody you love is awful. And I think that that's validating to recognize that.
Thank you very much, Bob. I just want to, this was a really lovely exchange right now, and what I was thinking a lot about during the talk is walking that fine line that I think sometimes we walk as CBT therapists between validation and what I've heard a lot of is like validation of emotion,
Right.
not necessarily, I'm talking a little more to that right now, not necessarily just like fueling like the process of being stuck in that, emotional.
It's like having, think about an emotion as part of a landscape of possibilities.
Yeah.
And for someone to say, oh, I shouldn't have that emotion, but I'm going to have that emotion, no matter what you say, and that emotion's going to come back. But do I get hijacked by it?
Exactly.
Do I define myself as an envious person?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
No, and that's the technique, I think. It's like validating the emotion without getting into the tornado, is that a tornado, whatever that is, with the patient.
Unless
Because
your hand moves.
sometimes, sorry?
Because your hand moves.
Well, whatever, because sometimes then you're like in that rabbit hole. It's as though you're reassuring an anxious patient.
Yeah.
You don't want to kind of, just get, like, with the examples that you're giving, like, yes, it's awful, yes, it's awful, yes, it's awful, yes, it's awful, and then, and then at the end of this, the session, they're like, ah.
Yeah, there are awful things happen, but I think a way of looking at it is one is to recognize that awful things happen. The other is to make room for them. Like, let me give you an example. I gave a talk like this a number of years ago at one of the universities, and the head of the clinical program came up to me after. he said this was very meaningful to me. He said, he was about in his late 60s at the time. He said, my wife died about 8 months ago from terminal cancer of the teeth, and it was time for her to die, and we knew it. We had been together for, I forgot what it was, 30 years, and had kids and grandchildren. He said, it's been 8 months since she died, and I'm still not over it. And I said, I don't think you should ever get over it. I think that you should be capable of feeling sad about losing the person you love for 30 years and had a life with. So I think you should have the capacity to be sad about that. And I said, but I want you to think about what I think you can also do is build a life large enough to include that. It's not about eliminating suffering. It's about building a life worth suffering for. And I think that a lot of times we think, I'm going to go through life and never suffer. You are going to suffer if there are meaningful relationships in your life. Because you're going to die, they're going to die. Terrible things are going to happen. It's just part of life. Life is tragic. It's not a comedy. It's a tragedy. It's wonderful and then unfair. Tragedy is unfair, over-the-top things, out of proportion things happening to people simply because they made a choice. They made a choice to be loved, to be connected, to have children, to have meaning in their lives. My view is a tragic view of life. But tragedy is not pessimism. It's not cynicism. It's that things are meaningful enough that you can actually witness it and say, that was really tragic. That was really awful. And to make room for it, to have a life large enough to contain that suffering, a life worth suffering for. And I think that's an important thing. It's like people who come across as superficial and shallow, like these superficial type of people, it's the ultimate sadness, is that nothing is meaningful enough to matter. And if you are attached, you're inextricably bound with loss. Doesn't that make sense? I mean, that's simply what it is. It's sort of like if you love somebody, you love your kids, you love your partner, your parents, or whatever, inevitably there's going to be loss. But if I had a patient who said, his father died when the patient was young, and he got very close to his uncle, and his uncle died when the patient was 14. He said, I think I'll never get over that. And I said, would you have rather not had that relationship with your uncle? If you had known that you would suffer from that loss, but the cost of having that relationship with him was that suffering. Oh no, I would definitely do it again. So the suffering was meaningful. It's having suffering that's related to a purpose, as opposed to a bland, superficial life, which I think is kind of slow. It's like death on the installment plan. Any other questions? In the back.
So it's not.
This is the last one, sorry, before we wrap up.
Okay, let me come up here so I can hear you.
Okay.
I don't know if the microphone is on back here, but.
Oh.
Maybe you can just turn it on and push the.
Okay. Oh, there you go.
Okay. So it's not so much a question, but thank you very much. This was very, just wonderful in many ways.
That's nice of you. Thank you.
And what I really took away from it is your, for lack of a better word, but a very holistic, inclusive way of viewing, human living, humanity, and the psyche within that experience. And also just like this idea of whether it's these angry feelings or envy or oppression or but they're all part of this experience. And I just was thinking of this current trend of happiness and pursuing this feel of happiness is kind of like almost replacing money, or I don't know. But there's something that isn't quite, for me, there isn't something that's very validating in a lot of this trend, because it's still like the next shiny object.
So let's imagine, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to give you a thought experiment. Can I use this? Sit on?
Hello? Yeah.
Let's imagine that you were single and you met somebody and they said, I really like you. Let me tell you about myself. I've been happy my entire life. I was born smiling. I've always been happy. I've never had a sad feeling. I'm incapable of any sad or unpleasant emotions. Would you want to have a relationship with someone like that? Why would you not? How many of you would not want to have a relationship with Mr. Happy Face? So why not?
I think that is a perfect case for failure, like setting up.
Right.
It's someone that is in denial of, again, their
Someone who's
humanity.
incapable of understanding you,
Well,
right?
and themselves.
How many of you would be bored with someone like that? How many of you would actually fantasize slapping that person in the face? Good for you. Right. So that kind of like happiness thing, it's wonderful to feel happy, but it's so meaningful to be angry about the right things at the right time, or to be sad. Like, I know if I go away to a convention, I have a lot of friends and stuff, and wherever I go, and people talk and all that, I always miss my wife, right? And I feel lonely, and I don't want to be the person who doesn't miss his wife. I want to have the capacity, like if I came home and my wife Helen said, "Well, Bob, did you miss me?" "Oh, not at all. I was entertained all the time. In fact, I never thought of you. I was happy all the time." See the grin on my face? I don't think it would go over well, right? So you think about these emotions of connection, which involve loneliness and missing somebody and thinking about them, reminiscing about things that have gone, people who died or whatever. Like, people think, I'll finish up now with this. People think, I know mindfulness is useful, to live in the present moment, but in reality, the only creature that lives completely in the present moment is a mosquito. I want to be able to live, I want to have an awareness of my childhood. I want to know what it was like to grow up poor. I want to know what it was like to have friends who were tough kids, mafia and stuff like that. I want to know, I want to remember what it was like to struggle. I want to remember people I lost. I don't want to get rid of sad memories. I don't want to dwell on it and be morose, but I want to include all of that. That's me. And the idea, Erik Erikson had a concept of identity, which I don't think anybody reads Erikson anymore, but he defined identity as a self-sameness across time and situations in the eyes of the self and the eyes of others. So you are an identity. You're not just simply a moment in time. You are a you. And that includes knowing where you came from. I don't want to be denying who I am, what I've been, what I'll become, or think that I'm okay and somebody else is not okay. You think about that we understand the emotions of other people because we are all screwed up. I'll leave it with that.
That's a good one.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Lindsay Colchin. I'm the event chair and board